Well, today we're talking about the Americas Without Sanctions campaign, the upcoming Human Rights Week, and all of the work that's being done against the sanctions which are being imposed against Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Joining me today are Cheryl LaBash, co-chair of the National Network on Cuba, and Barbara Larcom, who is the chair of the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition. Thank you so much for joining me today, guys.
Thank you for having us.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, I'd like to give both of you an opportunity to very briefly talk about your organizations and the sort of work you do for those who are not familiar. Cheryl, could you tell us about the National Network on Cuba?
The National Network on Cuba has been in existence since 1991, right at the time when all of the Cuba Solidarity movement in the United States came together to have a unified voice when Cuba was being faced with really an existential threat from the United States. And there was a lot of fear that there was going to be another Bay of Pigs invasion, that the United States was going to move in after the Soviet Union dissolved and really hammer hard at Cuba. So we came together then. We've been in existence since. We have more than 60 organizations, large and small, national and local, that are part of the National Network on Cuba. And we fight against the blockade. We do every aspect of it, from street demonstrations, petition campaigns, going to Congress. We do any place that we can raise the issue of Cuba, teach-ins, programs like this. Thank you so much. We do it.
And Barbara, why don't you tell us about what the coalition is up to?
Sure. The Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition, which we also call NICA Coalition for short, has been around for only a couple of years, but it's an outgrowth of an earlier network, the Nicaragua Network. And so the coalition has over 25 member organizations and several hundred individual participants so far. We have a website, which is nicasolidarity.com, and the interesting articles and information about Nicaragua are updated continually. We also share our webinars, which are at least once a month, about some aspect of Nicaragua. Our purpose is that we support Nicaragua in terms of its sovereignty. We believe that Nicaragua should be treated with respect, and the people and the government should decide their own future without being coerced into that future by the United States or any other government. And we also celebrate the achievements of Nicaragua, of which there are so many. I'll just mention a couple: that they provide education for people from preschool all the way through college, graduate school, professional schools, technical school, and it's free of charge in terms of tuition. And they also have free health care, universal health care across the country. They have, in the past 15 or so years, they have constructed 24 new hospitals across the country. The budget of Nicaragua is primarily aimed at social programs rather than any kind of defense budget. And that's how they're able to accomplish as much as they do, given that they have few resources compared to other places like the United States. So anyway, our coalition is very happy to support all this effort.
And do either one of you want to give us a summary of the Americas Without Sanctions campaign, which came about in the last several months and aims to bring together the resistance to these unilateral coercive measures that are imposed on these three countries in particular?
Well, I can start just to say that we believe that we should be a good neighbor in terms of the United States should be a good neighbor to all of its neighbors in the Western Hemisphere. And rather than doing that right now, it has been imposing harsh sanctions on at least 3 countries in this hemisphere, as well as about 37 other countries across the globe. In this particular campaign, Americas Without Sanctions, we're focusing on the Americas. And we do believe that sanctions, while they sound sometimes as if they're less harmful than all-out war, in fact, sanctions are a form of war. And many times they cause every bit as much harm to the people, the populations in the countries that are sanctioned, as war itself. In terms of deprivation of food, clean water, health care, health supplies, and so forth. Cheryl?
That's why we have a forum that will feature diplomats from all of the 3 countries that we're focusing on, as well as a noted Palestinian speaker, to raise the whole issue, to use the Human Rights Day, which is an internationally recognized day marking when the United Nations ratified these Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, that in fact there are 3 countries in our hemisphere that are actually trying to bring human rights to the population, and that is Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. These 3 countries, if the United States would stop trying to have these economic sanctions and trying to strangle them, they would be able to more fully develop the real human rights. One of the subtexts of what we're doing on the 10th, December 10th, the actual anniversary of the Human Rights Day, is sanctions kill. Human rights equals the right to live. And sanctions are, and the economic coercive measures really try to strangle these countries that are trying to provide human rights, where people have housing, they have health care, they have education. And in Cuba, for example, you have the right to sports, the right to culture, that during the pandemic, no one was deprived of an income, that people who had to leave work because their children were learning over the television, and they had to be home with the children during the pandemic, they didn't lose income. They didn't have to worry about being thrown out of their homes. There was a real social security there. And so these are the facts that we're trying to bring through the program on the 10th of December in Washington, D.C., which will also be available virtually for people who don't live in Washington. It's the purpose of this program to highlight that people in the United States in particular are blockaded from information. A very different view. These countries, Cuba is called a state sponsor of terrorism. There are all kinds of negative articles that appear in the capitalist press, which is why the alternative press like Kawasaki News is so important to us. So that's the purpose, to highlight it, to get the word out, to reach out to the communities, to mobilize people around these issues, and to get clarity on it. So there's a whole week, actually, from the 1st to the 15th. It's more than a week of actions. We've started a social media campaign. I'll share with you the social media hashtags and accounts, Camila, so that you can share them too. So it's a way of people following what's happening and joining in the discussion.
I'll just add one more thing about the events of next week, especially the public forum on December 10th. We talked about the 3 countries in this hemisphere, but the forum itself will also address the sanctions that have been imposed on Palestine, starting well before October 7th, which deprived the people of Palestine of the right to food and medicines and health care, even before the events of that horrible day. And so as a result then of Nicaragua in particular, and I guess Venezuela also and Cuba, supporting Palestine right away when all the conflict broke out, and Nicaragua actually bringing a lawsuit against the nation of Germany because Germany was providing weapons to Israel, which they were using to oppress the people of Palestine, bombing them. It was almost immediately after that even more sanctions were imposed on Nicaragua. So there is a direct connection then with Palestine. So one of the speakers at the forum on the 10th will be speaking about that issue as well.
Yeah, and Barbara, could you maybe tell us a little bit of the ways in which Nicaragua and these other countries have been targeted with new sanctions legislation, and what sort of effects it actually has had? Obviously, Cheryl could tell us a lot about the ways in which Cuba has been affected because it's quite clear, and the blockade is more than 6 decades long. But tell us a little bit, Barbara, what it is that we're aiming to prevent from happening with the way in which both the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States have sought more and more sanctions on Nicaragua.
Well, first of all, I'll say that back when Donald Trump was president the last time, he declared at some point very late in his presidency that Nicaragua was an extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States, which of course was ridiculous then, and it's ridiculous now because Nicaragua has a very small military budget. About half of 1% of its GDP goes for defense or military of any kind. And it's a country of 7 million people. How are they a threat to the United States, except possibly as a threat of a good example? But unfortunately, what happened is that every year since then, in November, President Biden has renewed that same declaration that Nicaragua is an extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. And he just did it again. And so that then allows more sanctions to be placed on Nicaragua, in addition to individual sanctions on several hundred Nicaraguan officials, which can interfere with their being able to carry out certain kinds of ordering supplies that are needed for the government or for performing their roles and carrying out services for the people of the country. In addition to that, the United States has put pressure on the IMF and the World Bank not to provide loans or other kinds of help to Nicaragua. And because of overcompliance, it has even gone into the areas of humanitarian aid that they received very little aid even during COVID. So all of this has had an effect on the country because in the past, because of their good record of paying back these loans from the international financial institutions, they had a good record with them. But now the United States is saying, don't give them any loans. So for the past few years, they received very little. And it's estimated that they've lost between $2.5 and $3 billion in loans that would have been expected during that time period since 2018.
That's quite a bit of money, and obviously the figures are far higher in the case of Venezuela and Cuba, who've experienced these unilateral coercive measures for much longer now. Cheryl, why don't you tell us a little bit about what Cuba has been weathering recently, of course, with the tropical storms and hurricanes and with the power outages and everything that we're seeing in the news here, and the difficulties faced on the island, of course, always further exacerbated by the sanctions, if not completely due to the sanctions imposed in the blockade.
Right. Well, first, though, I'd like to say a little bit about Venezuela and the fact that they've started the Guaido 2.0 program. There's an active political campaign in addition to the economic coercive measures on Venezuela that we need to be, very vigilant about. But in terms of Cuba, many people don't know that back in April 6, 1960, there was a secret memo in the State Department that actually laid out what the plan has been for Cuba and why the coercive economic measures have been applied. And that's the Mallory-Rubottom memo. And they lay out there that as secretly as possible to create economic hardship for the people of Cuba, and in so doing try to create turmoil and overturn the government that the people really supported in the revolution in 1959. So during the last Trump administration, because we have so much technology now, and it's so possible to really pinpoint the ways that Cuba was getting around a lot of the economic measures, the different sources that would overcome or fly in the face of sanctions and possible retribution by the United States. Those have been targeted to really snuff out any kind of hope that the Cuban people have for economic relief. So what we've seen over the past weeks is that Cuba's grid, the backbone of the electrical supply, has had to be restarted time after time because it's failed. They have been taking important measures to convert to solar and stop the reliance on oil, but they still rely on oil for power generation. And until the conversion to green measures can be completed, then they are going to have to depend on oil. So oil, Venezuela is under sanction. When at the same time that Biden opened up relations with Cuba, which showed what a Cuba without sanctions could mean. The measures that were taken were really very small, but there was this growth of all kinds of small businesses, cultural activities, tourism. There were the cruise ships, and a lot of people got to see Cuba for themselves, which we've advocated always, really since the early days of the revolution, that people should go to Cuba and see it for themselves. So when the Trump administration put more than 240 new targeted sanctions on Cuba and then put Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, it has made it virtually impossible for Cuba to do any international trade. Like Nicaragua and like Venezuela, any international humanitarian project has been blocked, has been stopped, has had more hurdles. These are important, and especially considering that Cuba's one of the main, or the one that's probably most known to people, sources of income is tourism, that Cuba has not been able to really recover from the pandemic when everything was shut down.
Absolutely. And that's something that I should say, of course, that I'm also a member of the coordinating committee of the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition, and have been since the start. And there has been, a great effort on the part, at least of our coordinating committee, to get people to come to Nicaragua and see things for themselves, because we've witnessed the way in which people have completely changed their minds about the country and learned a whole lot about what it is and what it isn't based on their experiences there. And it's been really an enriching experience to see the different parts of the country and to be able to speak to people and see that it's a really normal country, although it is, of course, under U.S. aggression and hostility and sanctions. The sanctions are still relatively new, and they have been able to mitigate a lot of them. And they're also working on constantly improving living conditions along with Nicaragua's various global South partners, and even some that are not from the global South. And this is a country that has, or a government which has worked really hard, in the area of diplomacy in order to ensure the best deals and the best development for its people. And I think people don't, of course, see that because they just remember the headlines in 2018, and at other times that's pushed by the Western imperialist media and the corporate media. And so it's been an amazing experience being able to welcome so many people to Nicaragua in recent years, post-COVID, I guess you'd say, on different delegations, and also for the celebrations around July 19th. And those experiences have really, I would say, paid off, because we have so many people, including a number of young people who've gone back to the U.S. or wherever they're from, but largely the U.S., to share, what they learned from the Nicaraguan people. Did you want to touch on a little bit more, Cheryl, about the campaign to get Cuba off the list in the U.S.?
Well, right now there is a big campaign, and it's a multifaceted campaign that our program on December 10th and this whole Americas Without Sanctions campaign is also focusing on. The Biden administration, which had promised when it was running for election back in 2020 to go back to the Obama years of easing the sanctions on Cuba, he never fulfilled those promises. And now he has a last opportunity to do that before he leaves office on January 20th. There have been wonderful newspaper full-page ads in the New York Times that said, Biden, you've got a chance now. You have a few days that you can take Cuba off the list. We are planning a demonstration at the White House to call for Cuba to be taken off the list. There are petition campaigns. The anti-sanctions one that Americas Without Sanctions is sponsoring, and Sanctions Kill. Also, DSA has gotten many elected officials and union officials. And I want to say the United Auto Workers International Executive Board has signed on to this petition for humanitarian relief for Cuba and to get Cuba off the list. So that those petitions are going to be made public tomorrow. There's going to be a press release going out. The Latin American Working Group has a wonderful 2-page letter. Also, the elected officials have sent a letter. There are individual letters from elected bodies that have passed resolutions. We have 117 resolutions, a lot focused on getting Cuba off the list, especially in the last year. So all of that, we're trying to find a way of focusing it and putting pressure on Biden and tell him it's a stroke of the pen. All he has to do is write a letter to Congress, and whatever happens after that, but he should live up to his promise.
Could I just add one thing?
Go ahead.
Cheryl mentioned that is going to be a rally at the White House. That is also during Human Rights Week. It's the day after the forum on December 11th. So anybody who's interested in either attending that in person in DC at the White House or watching it, if you don't live in the area, you can go to sanctionskill.org, and all the events and all the different links are provided there, and that will be a couple of them, including the petition as well.
And I also wanted to add that as part of our work in the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition, we are involved in the Zone of Peace campaign, which is also a relatively new initiative that was launched by Black Alliance for Peace, I believe in 2023. And one of its initial core demands is, of course, the lifting of sanctions against Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, among other very important demands, such as expelling SOUTHCOM, the U.S. Southern Command, from Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as ending the interference in the affairs of our different countries, particularly those that have been invaded so many times and the target of so many different aggressions, and also an end to the imperialist meddling in Haiti and the repeated attempts to occupy Haiti militarily with a multinational force, which is happening now, and impose U.S. Controlled puppet governments in that country, among many other demands. So these groups that are under the umbrella of the Zone of Peace campaign are all part of our anti-sanctions work, which has been really, I feel, picking up in recent months. And it's really good to come together with so many different organizations and voices. In the case of some of the better known I guess, faces that have been able to support this work. And I think it's really making an impact. Do you guys have any final things you would like to promote having to do with this upcoming Human Rights Week, or any of the initiatives or work that your respective organizations are doing at this time? Barbara.
I'd just like to summarize some of the main points that are included in the petition against sanctions that I hope everyone will go to sanctionskill.org and sign that petition. But the three main points are that sanctions actually are creating damage to vulnerable people in the countries where these unilateral coercive measures are being practiced, which is a third of the population of the world. But as a result of that, then many of these desperate people end up at the borders of the United States trying to reach this country, and then people in the United States are not really welcoming them with open arms, even when they partly because they don't see the desperation. They hear more of the legacy media anti-immigrant kind of message. So that's the first point, is that sanctions are driving some migrants to the U.S. borders. So it's against the U.S. policy is hurting itself in that way. A second way in which U.S. policy is hurting itself is that not only is it harming the economies of the countries that are sanctioned, but ultimately it's harming its own economy, because these various sanctioned countries around the world, and there are so many of them, are finding workarounds, and they're building alternative economic institutions such as BRICS, for example, so that ultimately the United States is going to be left out in the cold to a large extent as these countries find other ways of prospering for themselves. And finally, of course, we have to remember that the sanctions are immoral. They're hurting people, and if we're going to be a good neighbor in this country, we need to care about people and show compassion and humanity. Okay, thank you.
Cheryl, did you want to add anything to that? Any final words?
Well, yes, and that is that really what we have to do is spread the word inside the United States to counteract the propaganda, the anti-immigrant, the the pro-war, the pro-racist propaganda that's put out to the public in the United States. Our experience in the National Network on Cuba shows that the people of the United States are not united with this government and its right-wing, and I'm talking about the Democrats and Republicans, their pro-war, right-wing agendas. So our focus is winning over the people in the United States to understand that sanctions, in fact, do kill, and they also kill us. That all of the people of the world, including the people in the United States, have a right to live. And so many communities here, I live in Detroit, so many communities here are also suffering, but they're suffering from the same sources that are creating suffering around the world. So please join us, go to Sanctions Kill, sign the petition. Watch, if you're not in Washington, watch the forum on the 10th. Figure out what you can do to spread the word. Go to Nicaragua, go to Venezuela, come to Cuba for May Day. Join us.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Cheryl, for mentioning Venezuela very briefly, although we didn't talk a whole lot about it. Casacha News has done a fair amount of coverage of Venezuela and will continue to. And in January, they'll be celebrating the inauguration of President Nicolas Maduro, I believe January 10th, and will host a whole lot of international delegates and members of social movements and organizations. And so many people have had the opportunity to go to Venezuela and have, remarked that they just can't wait to get back there for any other opportunity possible, because you really see, particularly in the last short while I was there for the presidential elections, things have really improved in terms of your ability to make purchases. Everything is available on shelves that's available in any other Latin American country. And things have really, a lot of the sanctions have been mitigated thanks to the hard work of the government. And of course, some really great friends of Venezuela, friendly countries that have cooperated with Venezuela, on the basis of respect and mutual benefit. Things have really improved there, but it continues to be targeted by different forms of aggression, among which are, of course, the sanctions. And so, it's going to be a very difficult time when we see the sorts of people who are being appointed to the various government posts in the U.S. Of course, they're going to try once again to impose a sort of parallel government or a fake government in Venezuela come January as well. So we're on very high alert for that and on watch for everything that's going to come, with the opposition receiving so much funding and backing from the US and some other Western governments. So we'll be following that very closely. Thank you so much for coming on to speak to me about the Americas Without Sanctions campaign and Human Rights Week. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for the opportunity.